should go ahead and get started. If I could have your attention. I'm Margaret Watkins Tate from Baylor University, and I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's session on the scandal and the splendor of truth. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon my friend and colleague, Dr. David Lyle Jeffrey. Dr. Jeffrey is a distinguished professor of literature and humanities at Baylor University. His professional life has spanned both disciplinary boundaries and continents. After earning the PhD in English from Princeton University, he took a position in the English department at the University of Victoria. Subsequent appointments took him to the University of Rochester, New York, the University of Hull, England, the University of British Columbia, the University of Notre Dame, and the University of Ottawa, Augustine College, and Peking University in Beijing, before he landed in the really foreign territory known as Waco, Texas. He has authored or edited over 13 books and over 100 scholarly articles and book contributions on a wide variety of topics, including medieval literature, the literature of the Bible, the future of the university, and some important early work on medieval monsters, which I highly recommend to you. His recent books include Houses of the Interpreter, Reading Scripture, Reading Culture, and People of the Book, Christian Identity and Literary Culture. He has repeatedly served the profession as officer of learned and professional societies, and he has received numerous awards and honors, including membership in the Royal Society of Canada, myriad book awards, and the Conference of Christianity and Literature Award for Lifetime Scholarly Achievement. In addition to these many achievements and honors, David Jeffrey emulates, as well as anyone I know, the true definition of a scholar. To explain what I mean by that, I'd like to share a little anecdote from my honors introductory to philosophy class. I referred to one of Dr. Jeffrey's ideas one day about Augustine during a lecture on the Confessions. And I had one student who'd been quiet all semester, very reticent, who suddenly spoke out and said, "I just love David Jeffrey. He's such a wonderful teacher." It is this ability to inspire devotion, respect, and admiration in both students and graduate students which makes David a true scholar of the Academy, one who values mentoring as much as research. Indeed, one who sees the inextricable connection between the two in the communal activity of scholarship. During his time at Baylor, he has proven himself able to inspire such admiration not only in students, but in junior faculty as well, which I'm one, for whom he has worked with ceaseless determination and courage. I have never seen him succumb to that ever-present temptation of the Academy to attend to those with status at the expense of the rest of us. Many of us were drawn to Baylor because we met David Jeffrey in administrative interviews and found that no matter what our discipline, he could speak our language, many times quite literally. And we continue to be impressed by the way in which he is able to combine extraordinary academic excellence with extraordinary humility. All this, and there is just enough cowboy in him that you always know where you stand. Such breadth of knowledge and strength of character is inspiring, and it is difficult to overstate the importance of such things in a culture so desperate for inspiration. Please join me in welcoming David Lyle Jeffrey.
Well, Margaret, I am deeply grateful and kind of almost dumbfounded by the introduction, but I want to tell you that of all the compliments you just made to me, the one that really appeals to me the most is that you are the one wearing cowboy boots today, not me. I'm addressing a subject of great interest to me, and I hope there will be some interest to you. I want to give you a bit of a background on this. Like a lot of folks who were raised Baptist, I have had a lifelong interest in the question of religious liberty. I've been interested in what religious liberty is and what it has been historically and how indeed we achieve it. And as an academic, of course, I've been interested also in academic freedom. And while I was in Canada, that was a subject of quite a bit of concern, and I was an ardent advocate in some national debates on behalf of those seeking academic freedom. But when I came to Baylor University, in the course of the conversations that were taking place there, I recognized that the need for the definition of religious liberty in a religious university was somewhat different than the general concern for society as a whole. That the religious mission of the university brought to bear special considerations both on that question and on the question of academic freedom. And in the course of trying to think my way through these things about 15 months ago, I remembered a treatise that I'd read when it came out in 1990 named Ex Corde Ecclesiae. And I read it, and I read it because it worked up so many of my colleagues at Notre Dame that they were sort of bubbly around the mouth, and I wanted to find out why they were reacting that way. So I went back to that treatise, and it has a lot to do with what I'm going to say today. I'm going to talk about it, in fact. I want to make it clear, however, that I speak about this not as a Catholic. I'm an outsider to the tradition. And I don't speak really as an insider to the Baylor tradition either, as most of my colleagues would tell you there. I do not qualify as that. But I speak as one with a deep concern for these issues and for both kinds of traditions, and a deep affection for both traditions. I'm going to begin with a quotation. I'm not going to tell you where the quotations are coming from mostly. There are a lot of biblical quotations and quotations from Aquinas, both from the De Veritate and from the Summa here, but I won't pause over those. If you want them later, you can have them. But I want to begin with a quotation which I think probably lies behind David Solomon's choice of a title for this conference. And it comes from Augustine's Confessions, of course, Book 10, and it's cited in Ex Corde. And it goes like this: "In fact, the blessed life consists in the joy that comes from truth. Since this joy comes from you who are truth, God, my light." And I want to add to that a quotation which comes from one of my favorite English literary writers, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who has said this: "Truth, sir, is a cow, which will yield such people as skeptics no more milk. So they have gone to milk the bull." And I want to add to that another epigraph which comes from a little more contemporary source, and it goes like this. I'm not going to sing it, but I hope that you will recognize it, some of you. "Will you tell me this riddle? Who is the father of lies? Who is the master of half-truths? What is Madison Avenue?" And most of you, I can see, are either too young or, if not, of too refined a taste to recognize those last lines in their musical context, but they come from an album entitled Truth Decay by T-Bone Burnett, sometime compatriot of Bob Dylan, and he's also known for his music for the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," if that helps. But I think everyone can appreciate the singer's analogies. They're prompt to reflection on the way most of us come rather unthinkingly to accept that the evasion of truth is a normative mode of being in our culture. Currently, it seems a reflexive, habitual self-deception and deception of others has become about as normative to the university as to the marketplace for cosmetics and makeovers. It's what makes your conference poster such an oddity on an academic billboard, even a kind of sign of contradiction. It says, "The joy of truth." Because there's certainly a disturbing sense in which, as Jean Cardinal Danielou put it, in our time the very notion of truth has become scandaleuse, a scandal to many, so that in many quarters even to speak of truth raises the hackles, he says. Back in the 1960s, I'm dating myself, aren't I, Danielou devoted a superb little book to that conviction of truth, upon which, as also the great scientist Henri Poincaré has likewise observed, both the possibility of morality and the practice of science depend. And the question which drives Danielou's meditative argument is directly pertinent to our reflections here. Here's the question: how is it that to affirm the existence of truth seems to so many to be tantamount to dogmatism and intolerance? And to Danielou's answer and to his defense of truth, notably influential, by the way, for several encyclicals of the late Pope John Paul, I'm indebted in what I had to say as well. But the encyclical which first came to my mind when Dr. Solomon announced the topic of this conference was actually Veritatis Splendor, or if you took Latin from that sort of teacher, Veritatis Splendor. And in that, you remember, John Paul II challenged dissent within the Church itself concerning its traditional moral teaching and scriptural authority. And he linked this to a pervasive detaching of human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to truth. Whereas upon the biblical view, he said, human freedom and God's law are not in opposition. Certain currents of modern thought have gone so far as to exalt freedom and to do so to such an extent that it becomes an absolute, which then itself would become the source of values. I think we can safely here assume that the late pontiff was referring not only to the ascendancy of philosophical pragmatism, as for example in Rorty's more extravagant reductions of truth to what William James once called the expedient in our way of thinking, but also he is referring to existentialist, materialist, and let me confess it, radical Protestant notions of the supremacy of the will, which can, in the application, come to pretty much the same thing. And that's why he can speak, and I'm speaking of John Paul here, he can speak in his next sentence of the direction taken by doctrines which have lost the sense of the transcendent, or which have tacitly at least become explicitly atheist. The individual conscience is accorded the status of a supreme tribunal of moral judgment, which hands down categorical and infallible decisions about good and evil. The Pope's use of infallible here strikes me as a nice touch. Every man his own Pope. Most of us have known at least one or two adolescents who would like to resemble that remark. Some of you, like me, may have tried to raise one. But in most such cases, an established opposition in the will of freedom to truth is at least tacit. In many a campus controversy, I think it becomes explicit. I can think of someone quite a bit older than an adolescent, namely me, who, after the flesh or after the spirit, I know not, once took part in an event that was billed as a debate about academic freedom. And during this debate, my interlocutor posed a strategic question. There are two parties in contest here, he said, the Truth Party and the Liberty Party. I myself am of the Liberty Party. Which are you? Now, the casual antithesis presupposed by this question has, in secular context, long since ceased to be surprising. Yet the question asserts, of course, a false dichotomy, and so articulates that very bias that Danielou and John Paul II have so pertinently characterized under the headings, respectively, of the scandal and the splendor of truth. What I observed in truncated fashion then, I would reiterate here now. As most definitions make clear, academic freedom, that is, academic freedom is judged by most of us in the academy as necessary to the pursuit of truth, and thus to any authentic learning environment. It is less frequently observed that on this account academic freedom is ostensibly valued and defended by us as an instrumental good. That is, logically, it's not freedom per se, but truth that is ultimately to be valued, loved, and sought as the chief end of academic inquiry. Because our local debates, as some of you here know, had, at least that's the way I construed them, they were more specifically about the meaning of academic freedom in a Christian university. I then added a codicil to my remark, to my interlocutor, concerning a much abused saying of Jesus. In this saying, the relationship between freedom and truth is characterized actually as reciprocal, apposite, rather than opposite. And you know the statement very well. It goes like this: if you continue in my word, then shall you be my disciples, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And here it appears that truth is in fact a necessary condition for our freedom, or at least that the authentic experience of either requires the experience of both. And this reciprocity is the bedrock or substratum of the 1993 encyclical statement that human freedom and God's law are not in opposition. On the contrary, they appeal the one to the other. Contrariwise, however, those who live by the flesh experience God's law as a burden, says John Paul, and indeed as a denial or at least a restriction of their own freedom. Now, these 2 points from Veritatis Splendor extend to the episcopate, their propaidutic formulation already addressed to the universities in Ex Corde. When Ex Corde describes itself as an apostolic constitution on Catholic universities, it is already, of course, asserting something characteristically Catholic, namely, that in its initial purpose, history and tradition, or in their initial purpose, history and tradition, all such universities derive their authority from fidelity to apostolic and evangelical truth. But in a fashion strikingly parallel to most of the more developed Protestant universities, many Catholic institutions of higher learning have recently let it be known that they too wish that all that stuff could be relegated to titular acknowledgement or perhaps the footnotes of their mission statements. And as with most of the Protestant institutions upon which Notre Dame's George Marsden has commented, in many Catholic academic communities, for similar reasons, folks have come to regard freedom itself, narrowly defined as the individual scholar's right to a kind of insular autonomy, as the effective highest good. In such an environment, Ex Corde immediately announces itself as a document which comes not to bring peace but a sword. And let me recall just a couple of examples from that text, which I think may easily stand for all on this point. I'm reading here. It is the honor and responsibility of a Catholic university to consecrate itself without reserve to the cause of truth. This is its way of serving at one and the same time both the dignity of man and the good of the church, which has an intimate conviction that truth is its real ally, and that knowledge and reason are sure ministers to faith. That's the end of the quotation. Now, in this first extract, I think we immediately encounter that deeper word behind the text, which, as the epistle to the Hebrews says, divides asunder the thoughts and the intentions of the heart, whether we like it or not. In a Protestant learning environment as well, we use language like that. That is, we use language like honor, responsibility, and serving. They're to be expected of us. But Ex Corde doesn't stop there. It adds words like consecrate. Powerful word. I read this first in French. When one affects to consacrer something, there's a lot in that word. It has consecrate, and it has without reserve. Nothing held back here. Not just to academic truths either, but to the very cause of truth, that is the Lord of the universe. Moreover, as the citation of John Henry Cardinal Newman, which comes immediately in the next sentence, makes evident, these terms are advanced as the dedications at the very heart of the Catholic university because they presume that the heart's affections in a Christian university are going to grow ex corde ecclesiae, out of the heart of the faithful church. Now, the second polarizing statement, which I'm going to snatch out of Ex Corde for our purposes here, renders this presupposition explicit, and let me read it to you. One consequence of its essential relationship of the church, or to the church rather, is that the institutional fidelity of the university to the Christian message includes a recognition of adherence to the teaching authority of the church in matters of faith and morals. Catholic members are also called to a personal fidelity to the church, with all this implies. Now, when you're reading this from a distance, even, what you see is that here is a statement which, if it's politically problematic in many American Catholic universities, would be impossible altogether to parallel amongst their Protestant counterparts. The first reason for this, of course, is that by and large, our churches don't any longer have any teaching authority. In fact, as I've now come to understand it, there's a meaningful sense in which one might say of those Baptists in our part of the world who call themselves moderate, that the very idea of the teaching authority of the church would have been pretty much anathema at any point in their history. I don't mean that there aren't individual pastors with a lot of capacity to persuade, or that there are not characteristic references to Scripture when it serves a homiletical or a teaching purpose. But I do mean to speak here about ecclesiology. So here again we've urged, it seems to me, that as you Catholics and we Protestants, and we're all in the room here together, at least a lot of us are, we've urged toward common ground, muddy ground though it is. Just as there are widely divergent Protestant practices, even sharply divergent notions of what it is to be a Christian today in Protestant circles, so likewise it now appears to those from the outside, at least, also among Catholics. And it occurs to me that you probably have some ways to go before catching up with some Baptists, in this respect at least. And I suppose the Baptists are in some ways amongst the most extreme of Protestants, if we were to look at that comparatively and as a kind of comparative religious study in respect of this issue of insular freedom. But it also looks to me, and let me venture a strong hypothesis, that some of you Catholics are working to catch up. That in a way that the tradition is experiencing some of the same friction, some of the same fraction that we also have experienced. By the way, a Texas Baptist pastor I never met before in my life appeared at my office door right at the beginning of this term to offer a prayer, I think possibly even on my behalf. I'm still trying to reconstruct it. When somebody offers to come into your office and pray, you don't tell them no. So he came into my office and he prayed. But by way of introduction, he offered a sympathetic admonition to me. He said, coming from way up north there, he said, you just wouldn't understand, Baptist or not. He said, down here, a Baptist can be anything from a snake handler to a Unitarian. You know, I thought about that a lot since. I mean, it's occurred to me since then that there may be more commonality across that wide spectrum than the good Reverend's comment suggests. But that ironically what the commonality consists of might simply be that very individualism which has widened the spectrum. And in that sense he was describing pretty much the modern Western Christian world. Nonconformity, of course, which is our tradition, nonconformity resists the very idea of a common lot or a common prayer. Its purpose is individuality. Its reflex is to resist authority. And unsurprisingly, then, our most characteristic self can be independent, really independent, to the point of being not all that teachable. You know, we take a lot of ribbing about this, people who are in Baptist circles. The guy that loads my pickup truck at the feed store likes to say, oh, you can always tell a Baptist, just can't tell them much. And, you know, we all know these kinds of things that get said. But the way most Protestants, I think, have maintained such notions of teaching authority as we have is either through things like historic confessions or creeds, and at least amongst evangelicals and Baptists of various types, by affirmation of the central authority of the Scriptures themselves. I think most historians of the subject would agree that as long as strong lay literacy and biblical knowledge have prevailed in those communities, such groups remain reasonably coherent in their respective identities. And this has given to them a certain form and a set of governing principles which are employed in their colleges as well. During a multi-denominational conference somewhere west of here a couple of years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, I advanced the hypothesis that an evident decline in biblical literacy over the past 3 or 4 decades and a rising tendency to condone or even encourage subjective and therapeutic self-authorization in its place was posing an increasingly serious problem for the ongoing coherence of our communities, as well as for the cogency of teaching both in many of our churches and in our schools. I should acknowledge, by the way, that not everyone in free church circles sees this as a problem. Yet what troubled me then, and still troubles me now, is the way in which, for practical purposes, the authority of the Protestant individual has increasingly come to trump the authority of the Scriptures as well as of the Church. We temporize, we pick and choose, and our children follow suit with diminishing substantive options. At the level of the university, we have done little enough to redress this dissipation of a notion or a practical reality of a common truth. And rather in a manner now increasingly familiar, I think, amongst my Catholic friends as well, we seem to have set our faces, like flint, against anything that will constrain our choices. We have therefore come to resist anything that might be construed as imposing, even by inference, obligation to a universal truth or truths. Now, at the risk of perhaps too intimate an ecumenical suggestion, I think this is actually one scandal that we share. And worse, to the degree to which we share it, we risk becoming indistinguishable from secular pragmatists who have no faith pretensions at all. Let me come to the conflict part of this now by comparing our two documents that we think about at Baylor, at least I've been thinking about at Baylor, let me be more narrow, that have come to my mind to compare in the light of recent events. But I want to do so by reminding those of you who aren't philosophers about Philosophy 101. And here's how it goes. Almost the first datum, right, in basic philosophical reflection is a simple demonstration of the probability of a truth independent of the mind. And subsequent logical thought depends on it, so philosophers are at pains to get this lesson right. As Socrates in the Cratylus is at pains to show, therefore, to hold subjectively with Protagoras that man is the measure of all things, is immediately to bring the possibility of intelligible dialectic to a halt. If truth is to be meaningful as a term, it must preserve that meaning in some sort of objectifiable sense. In Rational Beings, Aquinas in his De Veritate tells us, the true denotes that to which the intellect tends. So far from being a self-referential construct, the true expresses correspondence of being to the knowing power. I'm quoting Aquinas still, for all knowing is produced by an assimilation of the knower to the thing known, and our knowledge of a thing is a consequence of this conformity. Therefore, Aquinas concludes, our knowledge of anything is an effect of its truth. I like that. That was a moment of recognition. When I first read De Veritate as a young student, as an undergraduate, that was a sentence that got underlined several times. It was a moment of recognition, of significant order for myself, and I've gone back to it many times. It's as though, you know, at that point that Aquinas is engaging the conversation with Socrates and Hermogenes. And he's allowing that while there's a limited sense in which the practical intellect causes things, and is in that sense a measure of what it causes, he says, with respect to our speculative or receptive or reflective intelligence, natural things from which our intellect gets its scientific knowledge can be more aptly said to measure our intellect. While in turn, he concludes, these things are themselves measured by the divine intellect, in which are all created things. This works in pretty much the same way, he says, in one of his characteristic analogies, as the way in which works of art find their origin in the intellect of an artist. You may remember that Aquinas follows closely upon Augustine and Anselm, particularly in this regard, and I'm thinking about Anselm's De Veritate, chapter 13, and in positing a supreme truth, therefore, self-subsistent, which is not to be confused with the truth of any particular thing, but, as Anselm has it, when something is in accordance with supreme truth, then we can speak of the truth or rightness of that thing. This truth, Aquinas wants to argue with Anselm as a reference point, is going to be an indestructible truth, therefore. Truths do not change, for even when true and correct things are destroyed, the truth or correctness by which they are true remains. Therefore, he says, there is only one truth. Per consequence, for Aquinas, as for Augustine and Anselm before him, truth is properly and primarily in the divine intellect. In the human intellect, it exists properly, but secondarily, because there it exists only because of a relation to the truths of nature, or divine truth. Now, some of you are going to be thinking, now, come on, Jeffrey, we're all educated at Notre Dame, and we know this better than you. And that's probably true. But what I am saying and what follows depends absolutely upon your knowing this, because the thesis of ex corte depends upon it fundamentally. As a working assumption, it recurs in several places. In the preamble of ex corte, we are told that a Catholic university is completely dedicated to the research of all aspects of truth in their essential connection with supreme truth. who is God. That's a very strong De Veritate type statement. In addressing, in part one, the identity and mission of the Catholic University, the writer of that document reminds us that the integration of knowledge, fides et ratio, requires that a Catholic university in particular has to be a living union of individual organisms dedicated to the search for truth, since it is necessary to work toward a higher synthesis of knowledge in which alone lies the possibility of satisfying that thirst for truth which is profoundly inscribed upon the heart of the human person. Does that ever sound right? Consequently, and problematically so for views of the university which make freedom rather than truth the supreme educational value, Ex Corde wants to insist upon the Catholic University as a covenanting community which has institutional autonomy and I'm quoting here now, guarantees its members academic freedom only so long as the rights of the individual person and of the community are preserved within the confines of truth and the common good. The problem with this attempt to balance individual freedom with a community commitment to extramental transpersonal truth is that in our time pretty much only a radically orthodox Christian, Catholic or Protestant, is willing, in the language of Ex Corde, so to be confined. That is, to try to achieve the balance between these two interdependent truths. I underscore here the most controversial element in Ex Corde precisely so that we can register adequately how it is that such a commitment to truth as this polarizes, how it divides like a sword. What is for some the splendor veritatis, the brightness of the truth which not only lights our way, but before whose precepts we willingly self-efface, or in biblical idiom, freely obey, is simultaneously for others a scandale profond, because they do not receive this truth as truth at all. Indeed, for such persons, even to link religious truth and the common good in this way is to impose a stumbling block. To suggest further that the exercise of individual academic freedom in a Christian university ought to be in some measure conditioned by a commitment to common institutional purpose is to enrage the bull. Now, you know, what is obvious to some of us in Protestant circles is just how evidently you and we find ourselves dodging about in the same corral from that bull. In the perspective of our ongoing, I think I can say my colleagues would agree, debate at Baylor on these subjects, I have found it highly interesting to reflect on the four principles of Ex Corde, even though it's a Catholic document, because in a sense it gets at some things with which we all have to wrestle. Here are the four principles that are laid out in Ex Corde. Most of you probably have them memorized or close to it, but for those who don't, let me read them. 1, a Christian inspiration, not only of individuals, but of the university community as such. That's the first principle, if it's going to be meaningfully Catholic. 2nd, a continuing reflection in the light of the Catholic faith upon the growing treasure of human knowledge, to which it seeks to contribute by its own research. Continuing reflection in the light of the Catholic faith. 3rd, fidelity to the Christian message as it comes to us through the Church. 4th, an institutional commitment to the service of the people of God and of the human family in their pilgrimage to the transcendent good which gives meaning to life. Those are the four principles, if you're going to be meaningfully Catholic, Ex Corde says, which you've got to be able to enact, to realize, to in some sense incarnate in the community of learning where you are. As you know, we have a document we call Baylor 2012. I was not part of the drafting of that document. Indeed, if memory serves, I contributed not so much as a sentence to that document. But anyone of you who may be familiar with it will recognize immediately how much these two documents, Ex Corde and Baylor 2012, actually have in common. Exchange the word church for the word scriptures, Catholic for Christian, and the principles are at the presuppositional level nearly interchangeable. But to get to the heart of our fracas in both cases, it's necessary to get to the practical implications of these principles. namely, an evident conviction that there is an undergirding view of truth in each case to which the intelligence in faithful communities is obligated. Not only obligated, but joyfully so obligated. For Ex Corde to be both a university and Catholic, there must be a community of scholars in which Catholicism is vitally present and operative. It must be that there is a place of research in which, and I'm quoting here, in which research necessarily includes the search for an integration of knowledge, a dialogue between faith and reason, an ethical concern, and a theological perspective. Finally, through an emphasis on interdisciplinarity in which the, and I'm quoting again, the specific contributions of philosophy and theology will play an enabling part, the theological potential of all the disciplines will obtain consideration. Thus, Ex Corde. Now, fewer of you will know Baylor 2012, but in the full text of that document, the following statements that I'm going to read also are printed at the very beginning of the document, laid out on the page in the form of a cross. Doesn't sound very Baptist, I know, but I mean, I was struck by that, and positively so. And these are the foundational assumptions, the document says, are the core convictions upon which the rest of the edifice is assembled. So, forgive me if I read these things verbatim. It's not that long, but every phrase strikes me as significant. Here are the core convictions. 1, that human decisions should be guided by God as His will and nature are revealed in the crucified and risen Jesus Christ. 2, that all truth is open to inquiry, though many truths will elude us and others may be accessible only through divine revelation. 3, that human life has a meaning and a purpose that is not simply a matter of choice. 4, that we have a fallen nature that needs both healing and direction. 5, that we are a created part of nature, but we have been given responsibility as stewards, made in the image of God for nature's care and management. 6, that we find the highest order of personal fulfillment in working constructively for the betterment of others, and that we have an obligation to do so. Next, that we need to be active, regularly worshiping members of the body of Christ as a context of our spiritual growth, as a source of encouragement, and as a partnership in the work of God's kingdom. Next, that human beings flourish best in a functional and beautiful physical environment amongst colleagues who respect, love, forgive, and support one another. And to this, all this is added a codicil, which says, and that a university can be such a physical and social environment, after all, because the church, the only truly democratic and multicultural community, is not identical with any denomination. We believe that Baylor will serve best, recruit more effectively, and preserve and enrich its Baptist identity more profoundly if we draw our faculty, staff, and students from the full range of Christian traditions, full stop. Now, though our formulations are more in the form of a traditional mission statement, I suppose, you will have heard, I hope, evident similarities to Ex Corde, and a read-through of the whole of both documents will discover many overlapping purposes. Yet here also in both texts we find the nub of the conflict each text engenders. This conflict is not primarily, I would suggest, about the infelicities or lacunae which doubtless can be pointed to in each text. Growing resistance has revealed not merely a friction concerning method or emphasis, but a deep impasse as to undergirding purpose in each case. That is, our contretemps, as one says in French, the parallel scraps that we're having. I learned in Texas to say fracas. It's just simpler than contretemps, isn't it? But our parallel fracases then concern not simply how we may go about the search for truth, but whether, at least in the ultimate sense, there should even be such a search for ultimate truth in the first place. Now that's an extravagant, strong claim. Let me defend it a little bit here. The more vigorous animosities, I think, arise not merely, as is often suggested, by partisans from some sort of propriety or scruple about mixing categories to the detriment of one or the other sphere. I'm inclined to think rather that what both partisans and opponents recognize, and I'm thinking here about either case, either document, is that to postulate systematically extra-mental truth, which ultimately coheres as one truth in the divine intellect, is to advocate for an authority irrefragably higher than the individual self. To the non-Christian mind, or to the mind that doesn't yet realize that it has left the gospel behind, such advocacy, however gently it is stated, will appear as a species of tyranny. How is it then that what is freedom for some is tyranny for others? At bottom, I think we can see that because the former group accepts the idea of self-transcending truth and actually, as Aquinas says, finds in the contemplation of such a unifying truth the greatest of pleasures, while among others, as Augustine notes, the very notion that there is such a truth out there to which we might conceivably be obligated engenders hatred. That's in Confessions 10:23, the very passage from which the title comes for the conference. Augustine is actually silently quoting Terence, the Roman playwright, when he says this, veritas odium paret, truth engenders hatred. But he's undoubtedly thinking about the hostility that his sermons apparently engage from time to time as he preaches them, and he feels this personally and in reality. A comparable hostility, I think, has been produced by Ex Corde and by Baylor 2012. Why do we, I'm speaking about us, why do we, in our own case, not see the magnitude of our opposition more clearly? I suspect it may possibly be because though our traditions in the Protestant world are reflexively oriented toward the Bible as distinctly revelatory of truth, we have probably become habituated to a kind of subcultural insincerity on this very point. Examples of selective cognition abound. One here must suffice, and that to our point. In biblical terms, truth is not only opposed to the open lie, but to dissimulation, to self-deception, to self-fashioning, to envy, to self-promotion. Now, for those of us who prepare websites, or who may be survivors in a zone of ecclesiastical politics, the logic of Scripture on this uncomfortable point may appear counterintuitive. But on the biblical view, T-Bone Burnett has it right. The master of half-truths, or Madison Avenue, pseudonymously, even if unwittingly, jive pretty well with the big daddy of lies, and sometimes in a most seductive way. If you grant that the repentant psalmist in that most famous of repentance psalms was likewise right about God desiring truth in the inward parts, then for most of us an examination of conscience, or maybe a miserere mei, and maybe even a trip to the confessional is probably frequently in order. More plainly put, perhaps we've failed to reckon adequately with the degree to which, for serious Christians, a sincere will to the truth carries with it a commitment, axiomatically, to holiness, to the pursuit of sanctity. Correspondingly, Christian institutions of higher learning dare sometimes to presume, as a condition of authentic membership, an active, sincere commitment to the communal pursuit of truth and right living. And this knowledge, I have to tell you, it makes me as uncomfortable as anyone alive. But I cannot see, as a confessing Christian in a confessedly Christian university, how we are to duck away from it. We should be grateful, I guess, that truth, emet, in the Scriptures, heavily through the Psalms and the Proverbs, is regularly linked to mercy. Let me now go to Splendor to conclude. It's appropriate, I think, that I return here to Augustine, since it's he, I conclude, who has given us this theme, and namely in this phrase, gaudium de veritate. In this joy, Augustine believes, this joy, our blessed life consists. If we are to have a blessed life, Augustine says, we must have this kind of joy in the truth. We live and move and have our being in this truth for Augustine, that God who says he is light. The God who Augustine says is my lumen and my splendor. We haven't got time here to analyze, of course, Augustine's argument in Book 10 of the Confessions, but it may suffice to observe that his stated concern is to order his own intellectual affections in such a way as to act in accordance with the truth he seeks and serves. Augustine recognizes, as do we, that truth divides, that even though there may be empirical evidence that it gives joy to some, that there are others, as he says, who maybe even don't desire true happiness, for all we know. And this adverse disposition occurs, he says, even amongst those who profess to seek the truth. There's a wonderful quotation from Augustine here, which I want to enter into the record, so to speak. He says they are disposed not to want it even when they have a clerical collar on, so to speak, because simply truth is loved in such a way that those who love some other thing want that to be the truth instead. Thus they hate the real truth for the sake of that other thing which they love in its place. They love truth when it enlightens them. They hate it when it accuses them. Summarily, the notion of happiness held by such people reduces to a kind of self-affirmation. They desire learning as a kind of therapy for their habits of mind and will, and it's, in fact, a kind of freedom from the constraints of truth, which is their truthful objective. But this can't be true happiness on Augustine's account, or true freedom either, he says, because its critical prerequisite is self-deception, of which the self is at some level always going to be aware. In this sense, ironically, the only authentic freedom is in confirmation of our own will to the truth as it is in God. True happiness, he says, is to rejoice, therefore, in the truth. For to rejoice in the truth is to rejoice in you, O God, who are the truth. You, my God, my true light, to whom I look for salvation. This is the beatitude. This is the happiness which we all desire. On Augustine's view, those who cannot imagine a freedom which is not self-defined are going to miss out on true freedom altogether. Yet for those who have found in God truth itself, there is going to be perpetual delight, a kind of holy joy. And for these folks, the brightness, the splendor, as he calls it, of the truth, enlightens everything else it touches, allowing the scholar to live, as Milton puts it, beholding the bright countenance of truth in the quiet and still air of delightful studies. I love that sentence. When both an English Protestant intellectual such as Milton and a French Catholic mathematician and scientist such as Henri Louis Poincaré, at least in this statement I'm going to read you, can agree upon, is, as Poincaré says, that the search for truth should be the goal of all intellectually honest activities and the sole end worthy of them. And Poincaré adds this, he says, if we wish more and more to free man from material cares, it is that he may be able to employ the liberty obtained in the study and the contemplation of truth. It's in his conviction that regard for truth precedes liberty rather than the other way around that you can recognize in Poincaré a Christian thinker too. He too acknowledges that on occasion truth can frighten us, that partial truth can be deceptive, but he holds firmly to the principle that in the end truth is one, that it is accordingly incumbent upon the fearless intellect to seek both scientific truth and moral truth without an artificial imposition of boundaries between them. Whoever loves the one, he insists, cannot help loving the other. These two truths, scientific and moral, when discovered, give the same joy. Each, when perceived, beams with the same splendor, so that we must see it or close our eyes. This affirmation, from one who at the beginning of the 20th century was doubtless the world's premier mathematical scientist. is consonant with Augustine, the 4th century theologian, and John Paul, the late 20th century pontiff, both in logic and in language. They share an affirmation of joy in truth, I would suggest, which will be present whenever a learning community faithful to the gospel is gathered. And such scholars can, in Augustine's sense, rest in this joy, not just because our shield and defense is the idea that there's such a thing as divine truth, but because our commitment and our joy in the work we do is constantly being renewed, even when we are reflectively and analytically inconsistent. And because of the promise of Jesus in the gospel, that the Spirit of truth will guide us to truth. He is, after all, the true light who enlightens everyone, for it's Jesus alone who can say, ego sum via et veritas et vita. I am the way, the truth, and the life, whose very name in John's apocalyptic vision is revealed as faithful and true. I'm speaking of the apocalypse. And on this view, joy in the truth is fully the possession of those alone who love the truth, as Pascal and his Pensées and the beloved disciple agree in saying. Perhaps one needs to share, this is the riskiest thing I'm going to say, but let me say it. Perhaps one needs to share in this deepest of affections to be able to have real affection for a vision of the university such as you find in Baylor 2012 or Ex Corde. It may even be the case that those who don't embrace that affection, that order of love, are less likely to remain neutral or indifferent than to hate such a document passionately. But if either punch holds any water, it follows that obtaining a deeply Christian account of the relationship between personal intellectual freedom on the one hand and the religious liberty of institutions to operate out of a commitment to shared religious truth on the other will be indispensable to us if we are to succeed in our stated missions. Despite much misunderstanding and controversy, I therefore continue to think that achieving a balance between our institutional freedom to advance a religious educational mission, something repeatedly sustained by the courts, and at the same time encouraging a mature exercise of academic freedom in its original purpose and for those ends, encouraging that amongst our colleagues and students, that joint task is an effort in which we must persist. Even as John Wycliffe once said in a work called De Veritate Sacrae Scripturae, he was struggling amongst his colleagues at Oxford in the 14th century, and he said, what I realize is at stake here is a crisis over legitimate authority, and it's a crisis which lies much more deep than overt politics. If we're to come through this toward a joy and truth, a peace deeper than political compromise, I think will be necessary for us to even maybe a peace that passes understanding. And for such peace in our own polity, I suspect we will need first the grace of a true repentance, as well as, frankly, works meet for repentance. And by these means, if by any, we may yet have hope to share more widely in the joy of truth, at least until we finally arrive at what Dante in his Paradiso describes as pure light, light intellectual, full of love, love of true good, full of joy, joy that transcends every sweetness. And that light, of course, alone shall be for us splendor sine occasu, brightness never ending, when he who is true truth shall make even the sun in our galaxy a dull redundancy. Thanks be to God.
We have plenty of time for questions. So,
I just wanted to have some clarification on the Baylor 2012
am not competent to extrapolate upon this discussion to national issues, and so I shall not do that, if you will forgive me. But what I will say is that it used to be the case when I was your age that one thought of Protestants as defining their ecclesiastical polity largely in democratic terms, while at the same time we thought of Catholics as defining their ecclesiastical polity largely in hierarchical, and sometimes, if you had a negative view about Catholics, autocratic terms. I think that that division in the mind, which may not have been true then, is certainly not true now. I think there's a contest in the Catholic world which has, in a sense, come to mirror the contest in the sort of democratic, especially liberal Protestant world, in which the idea that the Church, in a sense, is a guardian, an authoritative transmitter of truth, has come into question in many of the ways in which Scripture has come into question in the Protestant world. And there are some difficulties that are occasioned for both traditions, partly because of that. But that's just to get at the tip of a big iceberg, because in the university, I think for a long time in both Protestant and Catholic universities, I'd say especially since the 60s, the idea that the primary function of the active intellect is to question authority in whatever sphere one finds it has been the dominant reigning idea. And that's a good idea. I mean, I try to raise my kids this way. I'm a sort of a Calvin and Hobbes type dad, you know. I problematize life so that they learn to be critical about the kind of things they might get told. But I don't do so out of a context of assuring them in other ways that there are certain things which are worthy to be believed and which are warrantable, right? Now, there's the problem for us, is to get a consensus on those things which are worthy to be believed that actually affect the way we live, right? Constrain our life. And in that sense, I think it's not so much as, I think we have problems which are peculiar to the degree to which we think democracy is a matter of licensing individualism. I think that we have a problem there. I don't know how that is going to work itself out in the Catholic world. I'm kind of encouraged to think that with the current Pope and your last Pope, that there's a lot of very good thinking gone into this, in some sense that there is and is necessarily going to have to be an authority which constrains choice and liberates choice, is sort of central to health in the body of the Church, just like it would be analogously in a marriage. There is some authority upon me in my life in marriage which constrains choice and therefore makes me freer than otherwise I could be, you see. Now that's a long way around by way of saying it doesn't break down quite so simply maybe into the categories we think it would. Yes, sir.
First, I thought it was a marvelous presentation. But since I am a Texan, I can give in to temptation for answering ask my question was aligned to hers. There may be a Tansian dot. Don't forget, the Orthodox understand the Church as being synodal.
Yes.
And that's quite a different way of organizing Christian polity, either from being democratic or being autocratic. If you look at it as a synod over time, then I'm coming to the question I'm about to ask, you get to that scandalous line in Hebrews 13:8, Christ the same today, yesterday.
Today, forever.
Now, if the Church is the body of Christ, it's going to be that way. That brings me to my question that I think you raised together two senses of the truth that bother people in our contemporary society. One's an object level concern with the truth.
Yes.
The other is a meta level.
Yes.
At the object level, there's some people who say there is no truth. And they're like Dorothy or like Vitamo or like Santiago Zabala at the Pontifical Lateran University. There's no truth. There are others who say there is truth, but at the meta level, we don't know what it is yet. And so we have a developmental understanding of how we'll look at either doctrine or Bible, so that we can pick up the Bible, and just because it says homosexual acts are sinful, men have headship in the church or in the family, that's just too outrageous for our contemporary society. Can we develop our way out of that? So it seems to me we're confronted at two levels with the dispute about the truth. One, whether there's a truth, and the others will say, yes, there is a truth. but we just know it developmentally and over time, and I will interpretively step away from the Bible or developmentally away from the dogmas, and I'll get to Christianity, which will much more comport with my inclinations as a passionate Texan.
I don't think that was a question, right? Tristan was... Yes, okay. Yes, sir.
I know you're not a Catholic, so you might may not want to speak to this totally, but initiatives like X48, Baylor 2012, etc. X48, although at a very local level, inspired great vitriol, it's very insignificant in the national arena. It's been used in permanent commission statements in a way to placate local bishops who have also been complicit in an activity. So if you go to the Newman Society website or a variety of other scholarly sources even, there's, vagina monologues will be at a variety of Catholic universities this year. Gay lesbian organizations will be at universities this year. No one's really acting. What's to prevent these initiatives from becoming irrelevant, insignificant, and NTPR?
Well, that's a fair question.
I am a Catholic, and I'm
Yeah. Well, I think what we recognize is that we're having a great deal of difficulty getting what is necessary for such a thing. Two things. One is a consensus gentium, right? That we shall accept authority other than ourselves on our own free choices. That is the hardest thing in the world for American culture right now. It's not difficult at all for I spent a lot of time in China, and it's not difficult at all for Chinese Christians. But it's a huge stumbling block for us because we hold freedom to be the highest good. But in so doing, we are actually in contradiction to the gospel, I would suppose. And so if that's true, then part of the teaching job of the church is to encourage us to develop, again, a consensus gentium concerning the legitimate authority of the teachings of Jesus and the apostolic traditions. Let me say this as a Protestant, the apostolic traditions which hand it down to us and help us to understand and apply those teachings. I don't know any other way out. Can't imagine it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned how it's common in our day that people who refer to truth or to foundations are considered potential tyrants or fascists. And what puzzles me about this response is if we really truly lived in a completely individualistic, anarchistic society, where there were no constraints on us, then I could see someone who brings up truth as wanting to perhaps impose a constraint. One might say, we want to resist that. But in fact, if we live in a society where you're going to be very constrained anyway, laws are going to be passed, people are going to be convicted of crimes or declared innocent, people are going to be manipulated in many ways, and if there's no truth, we don't even know when we're being manipulated, or if we do somehow realize it, all we can say is, I don't like it. So it makes us more vulnerable, more worse off. We're dropped into a Kafkaesque world of the trial where we just don't know what is happening. How can people in this ever more interdependent and unfree existence give up the idea of truth, which is the one thing they can hold on to as something to criticize, to use to criticize?
Yes, well, I obviously agree with you. That is with your cri de coeur. That suggests that, in fact, if you don't have a valid working consensus gentium on what truth is, you don't have a valid working consensus gentium on the possibility of justice, and in place of the will to truth, we get the will to power, which is that's a lot about our law schools, actually, and it's a lot about the trial. The attack dog trial lawyer lives off, what the problem that you're describing. I think partly our difficulty has been that we haven't, as churches, borne effective witness to both the existence of that truth, but also the way in which it ought to constrain moral formation and moral action. And I think both Catholics and Protestants are pretty keenly aware that we, in a sense, have not shone that light where it needs to be shone as much as we ought, and it's partly because we ourselves are sinners. And that's what I meant about, we need to pray for the grace of a true repentance, because we who are involved in educational institutions have not always served the need for the articulation what my dad would have called the faith once delivered to the saints, in such a way as it intersects with these issues. We just haven't done that very well. We've been instrumentalists. I talked at the beginning about the confusions that we regularly make between instrumental goods and higher goods. But we have done it culturally to such a degree that we sometimes don't even notice we're doing it. And I think it's affected the way we articulate our curriculums and the way we have made the professionalization of knowledge another instrument of the will to power very often rather than something higher. It's a big subject that you're opening up, but those are just some thoughts. Yes, sir.
You comment upon common culture and truth as being a product of a divine intellect. Because with common culture, what frightens me is that it is absent of any intellect at all.
Right. First of all, let me come to your last comment first. Common culture doesn't seem to have an intellectual basis. I think that's often been true. I'm teaching currently the age of Constantine, and my students are discovering that it wasn't all downhill skiing and powder snow. In the age of Lactantius and the Divine Institutes, for example, in the life of Constantine the Great. Because these same problems are perennial problems. We look instinctively, especially as reflective people, we look for a kind of logos, a kind of ratio at the heart of culture, and of course we don't find it because probably let me venture this if it's not too much of a risk here, but I mean probably what the scripture says about our defective nature is true. And as long as we've got this problem of defective nature, then we are going to resist, in fact, the creation of such a common logos or ratio at the heart of culture. The only people that will do it are people, and that's what, of course, the 4th century was all about, are people who are willing, as it were, to submit their own choices, their own freedoms, to the search for a collective appreciation of that logos which enters into history. And they lived in a radically different way, and the kind of life which is, I'm not recommending like Alistair McIntyre that we all run off into the hills, and form little monastic communities, but there's something in that. And what he's really saying here is that unless we are willing to, in a sense, voluntarily constrain our own appetites, we are part of the problem. And I think that's unavoidably the case. I think whether we look at that economically, politically, or theologically, that's the case. So how do you get there is the question, and I think part of the way you get there is for the church to become vitally, again, as much as possible. It still is in many places. We need to become vitally the body of Christ, ministering to the world and to each other for the sake of Christ. And I'm not a theologian, but let me just say that in those terms. I really believe that. But that means that the gospel really has to condition in a fundamental way the way we approach problems in all the other spheres. One of the great things about Ex Cordi, one of the greatest things about the Catholic University historically, and one of the great things about Baylor 12 is it grasps that that's the task. That we have to, in a sense, put what's at the center. And if we can only do that, we can begin to shape our own minds and the minds of our students in such a way that they can then carry on that task. And I believe passionately, therefore, in the virtue of these kinds of documents. I happen to, as I said, I didn't have anything to do with the creation of Baylor 2012, but when I read that statement in the cross, I said, I can give my life to this. I will take it phrase by phrase and offer my life to it, because it is a way in which I can serve that very goal that you're sensing we need to have. And I think that that's what Catholics and Protestants should be doing analogously in various ways. And it'll take the formation of other statements, mission statements. But the principles that are laid out in Ex Cordi are tough to argue with as basic presuppositions. We'll have to have something like that.
In some of the Protestant circles, truth is given more to perhaps people sitting in a church service as simply preached from the pulpit, not reasoned out. Whoever is given it may have reasoned it out themselves, but those of us who are receiving truth or receiving messages on how to live are given more truth as it is yelled at us, as it is just said, these are, this is the datum to be given you. Do not waver from this. If you waver from it, you're considered a heretic, not given any reason, or if it is, it's a very shallow line of reasoning to justify that statement. And so then if we go into the university, in which the case we're having at Baylor, is how do you get people interested in pursuing this light of wisdom? Then they're sitting here going, oh my goodness, I've never been told I've actually been allowed to reason truth for myself.
Well, that's a problem too, because really mature formation in any religious tradition involves going from those things which are given as datum in the religious tradition to a careful, thoughtful reflection on them, much as you know by now, Aquinas invites you to do when you're considering proposition after proposition. And there are always said contras, and there are always other kinds of points that can be made, and there are always things that have to be reasoned through, because, as John Donne says in his sermons, Volume 3, page 359, if you want to look at the Potter and Simpson edition, we cannot come to a mature faith except we go through knowledge. Knowledge by itself will not get us there. We need faith beyond it in order to bring us home. And that's the way it is. And here's the problem. In all of our churches, we've suffered from a dearth, it seems to me, in America, of that kind of preaching, which in a way lays out the text, expounds the text in such a way that we can reason with it, we can think it. Nothing made me happier today, by the way, than that one of your colleagues tells me, who's a classics and philosophy major, that he's heading to seminary. Because in his tradition, it's not common to have preachers who have that kind of formation, right? And as a result, what we get is therapy, right? And it's a trouble for us. And your generation is beginning to realize that it's not enough. So thank you for saying that.
One more question.
If the ability of Christian universities to actually be Christian universities depends upon their dethroning freedom as the highest good, and that in turn is dependent on a willingness to restrain our appetites, I wonder to what extent Christian universities can even be universities in another characteristically modern sense, which is not just the unfettered pursuit of whatever interests me, but in the sense of being the purveyors of the very best services and amenities to our customers in a competitive market. I think about the fact the arms race to build better and better fitness facilities, the arms race to build a student life exercise center that is incomparable or that is beyond compare with our immediate competitors. I think about the fact that our libraries have Starbucks coffee, which you can carry through the stacks, which is theoretical in some sense. I mean, to what extent really to take this seriously? Do we have to even be able to, do we have to begin to rethink some of the most axiomatic assumptions that make us, universities in general, marketable?
Well, Michael, as you know, as you will appreciate more than most, the reference to Madison Avenue is not for nothing in here. We do live in an advertising-driven environment. It's a marketing environment, and everybody is in an arms race, really, to up the quality of the product and to make it more attractive to kids, and it's gotten to be silly. And we also know, all of us who are academics and really love the life of the mind and love the things we have to read, know that you can have a brilliant university in a barn someplace with the right students and the right professor. That's what Plato demonstrates with Socrates. What we have got to do is we've got to be able to constrain our general cultural appetites for creature comforts. I once heard a university president say, just give me the luxuries, the necessities I can do without. And he meant it sort of tongue-in-cheek. But he was talking to board members. And I thought, we all laugh at this. We can all make jokes about it. But we are looking at something which is a bit out of control, maybe more than a bit out of control. And universities, in order to create a counterculture, often do that quite deliberately. So you'll establish an honor scholars, let's say, within the university, which in fact attracts kids who are not going to be primarily oriented towards those avenues of appeal. And some of them, in fact, the very best ones are likely to have the highest standards and to set the toughest agenda for courses. It's going to be the case that the kids are going to work harder in those programs and stay up longer, as Boccaccio says, at nights until they get it. And they're going to come and have ferocious conversations. And it's not going to be as important to them to watch the next episode of Desperate Housewives on the 60-inch screen, plasma screen in the library. I mean, you know, I think we are, in a way, needing to learn how to move the Christian university. And this is the most, I really am getting in trouble here. But if we really want to do, you know, the Christian university seriously, we must be willing to create a counterculture. We must have a university that is a sign of contradiction. That's why I just love what John Jenkins said. Because when he was in IRA, he said, you got to dare to be different. That's the principle. You've got to, in some sense, say, no, we want something better. He's going to have a hard job. He's president of an enormous university. Everyone needs to pray for that guy every day. But if you can do that meaningfully with smaller units, and I think this might be a great era for the church in all of its departments in America to consider just such formations, honors colleges, programs in which rigor of an intellectual sort is the sine qua non of being a part of the program, and which spiritual life and theological formation and worship life is taken to be at the heart of the total work to do. And if we could do that, and we could even do that for 5% of our students, that would change America in another generation. I think it's the only way I can imagine realistically, Michael, to approach the problem that you raise.